Hello, everyone. We're happy to see you. Let me welcome Margaret Courtney Clarke, who came here from Namibia to be with us today. She was shortlisted for our 8th cycle of the Prix, which had the theme Hope. The book is also lying around here to exhibitors. And her series was called Cry Sadness into the Coming Rain. We come to that later. I need a piece of paper here because both of our distinguished photographers have been awarded so many prizes and awards that I want to read out a few. So I'm not going to do this for the next hour. But so Margaret had over 200 exhibitions around the world. She's been recognized by the Deutsche Fotobuch Prize. She has the Krasner Kraus Book Award, the 2018 PDN Photo Annual. She was nominated 2015 for the Foundation Enricata Bresson HCB Award, and the most proudest moment for us was, of course, that you were on our shortlist of the Prix Pictet. David is on my right. David, maybe you want to say your last name properly because everyone is asking me how to pronounce your last name correctly, so everyone hears that once from your mouth.
It's Uzochukwu.
Uzochukwu. So for everyone, now everyone knows. So David is Austrian Nigerian. He was shortlisted for our 9th cycle of the Prix Pictet. That's one of his photographs. You see it on the front cover of the book. He has been commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund. He exhibited at Photo Vogue Festival. He has the new Black Vanguard, a Rencontre d'Art. He's nominated for an ICP Infinity Award. He is named as the one to watch by the British Journal of Photography. And I can't say that much about myself, but my name is Isabelle Ribbentrop. I'm very honored to be the executive director of the Prix Pictet. For all of you who don't know the prize, we founded it 13 years ago. It's a Sustainable Photography Award. We're very proud that we were a so-called forerunner before even Instagram was founded. We had the idea to ask photographers around the world to send in their series of photographs relating to sustainable and environmental issues. As you can see, for us, the most important point is that we tour with the Prix Pictet around the world. And we're not doing this to show off. We're showing this to reach a global awareness on these pressing issues for the environment. We ensure that every exhibition of the Prix Pictet has free entrance so that anyone in the world can see that. That's also very important for us. I know everyone, hopefully in this room, is very privileged, but there are many people in the world who can't read or write, and we want to make it accessible for anyone so everybody feels a sense of, I'm also responsible for what I'm doing. So I'm delighted to be here with both of you today, and I want to say it's very rarely happening that we have 2 photographers coming from so far apart, 2 countries, and from 2 different cycles. So this is a great honor for us. This is the last thing I'm saying because it's about you two and not about us in that sense. So to both of you, Margaret, maybe to you first, both of you have different approaches in photography. You're both artists, obviously, but what drew you initially to photography? Because now everyone takes photos and thinks they're photographers, but it might have been different back then when you started. What drew you into photography and not any other artistic expression? Margaret, from your side.
Well, as a very young child growing up in Africa, I had a love for art. I grew up on a farm in Africa, and my first years were spent with the Bushmen or the Sand people of Namibia, in storytelling and in rock painting and rock engraving. So I spent my childhood drawing and scribbling on slate and stone, and that's how, and my art developed. I eventually graduated in art in South Africa and photography. I was heading towards advertising, and I decided I didn't want to work for anyone else, and I didn't like the advertising and the commercial approach. So because there was so much in Africa, I felt needed storytelling, that I specialized in a more journalistic or documentary approach to photography. So it has really been my entire life, so almost
your passion.
70 years of art.
And David, what drew you to photography and not any other art medium?
It was quite random. I think I keep thinking back on it, and it was actually I had a holiday crush who was really into photography, and I realized at some point I just like picked up. I just ended up like stealing his passion, and ended up kind of like entrenching myself in an online community of photographers who were really active on social media back then, and just found myself super fascinated by a lot of like young self-portrait artists expressing themselves, and kind of taught myself some sort of visual literacy and digital post-production techniques, and I found it very accessible, I think, in a way, and that is it's quite straightforward in itself. I think photography is not a very complicated or hyper complex technique, and so that I think was part of the appeal of being able to take that and then develop one's own style.
Do you have anyone in your life or anyone we might know who inspired you or inspires you in terms of photography? Or
I mean, in the early years, it's really interesting because I really followed a lot of people a lot of people's work who were not that much older than me. So there's this young German photographer who many might not know here, but Laura Zelenga. She was a really inspiring self-portrait artist. And then I started looking up at other people who were building these big like worlds and almost like sets for their photographs, like Gregory Crutzen and Tim Walker, and who had this fantastical approach to their work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Margaret, did you have anyone who inspired you or still inspires you, a photographer, or in your personal life?
Oh yes, but my time in my years in discovering photography, I was, I think, hugely influenced by the farm security
Yeah.
associated photographers and the Walker Evanses and the work they were doing, documenting the drought, which is very much related to what I'm doing currently in the desert, in dust storms and salt storms. Yes, that back in the 60s, and then in more recent years, the work of David Goldblatt in South Africa influenced me.
Yeah. That's all right.
Yes.
David, a question which might come up: are you? That's everyone is always asking. Are you using a lot of Photoshop in your work?
Yeah, for sure. No, to me it's almost like the second half of my process. It's like I sketch images out beforehand, I go to shoot them, and then sometimes they really come together in post-production, combining different images from, sometimes images that were taken over a stretch of multiple years, then kind of all fused together in this digital space, and it's like a space of experimentation and yeah, really part of the creative process still.
Margaret, you don't do that at all, no? Post-production, that sense.
No.
It's more journalistic photography, no?
No post-production, except perhaps tweaking, highlighting a little bit of what's in the in the shadows. I do tend to work a lot during the midday heat, because it takes time to get anywhere, to reach anywhere. So I try to stick quite accurately to the light. I observe the light to its nth degree and what it does and what you can see because I don't listen basically to my camera. I don't allow my camera to take its own readings, because it just puts everything in the shadow into pitch black, whereas the eye in such bright light, it can see everything in the shadow.
Yeah.
And
So coming back to my original beginning, so photography and sustainability, many people can't really make a connection with it, and especially Margaret, you're serious. I mean, it's very touching. I mean, you told us back then, I don't know whether it came up already, the tree in the desert, the flowers. What's your relationship between your photographs that you've taken? Maybe there's also something personal, but with sustainability. Where do you draw that relationship?
I like to think of my practice as part documentary overlapping with activism. So look, I have a 50 years of experience of deserts, and it's a very, very fragile ecosystem. It requires interest, public interest. It requires government input. There are many aspects of it. In Namibia, we have almost a zero rainfall. In fact, we're going through our 7th year drought this year. We have no running rivers. They're all dry, and occasionally, once every 10 years, a river will run. So I'm always fascinated by the survival under these very harsh circumstances. When most people think of a desert as a place of nothingness, but there's a very acute life and survival, and it takes a lot to sustain and to adjust to it, whether plant or animal or human life. So the fragility of it is quite extraordinary, and yet there's also so much hope, because as in that tree that had 3 flowers on it, and at the time I was doing cancer treatment myself, and I thought, if this plant can survive, so can I. So it is, for me, it's a place of healing, the desert.
Yeah. And especially in Namibia, can you tell us a little bit about the resilience of the people in Namibia? Because that's something that always comes up again, and you probably...
Well, just because it's here at the moment, this young man, Francois Urikop, is raising pigeons, and the title of this work is I Will Get Rich. So that is about this young man supporting his 7 siblings during the drought, and aggravated more in these last years by COVID and lockdown. We have seen a tremendous amount of poaching, deaths of both animals and humans. So it really is a struggle. They live on very little, but there's always hope in trying to make ends meet. Sustainability, I mean, these are reservoirs that have been destroyed by elephants, and I made a triptych out of that with the elephant prints. So that's another big issue in sustainability. How do human beings live side by side with animals? There's a lot of poaching. There's extraordinary, unbelievable corruption and mismanagement in the country at the moment. So it's all very fragile.
That especially the boy you just described with the bird in the cage, you took that serious obviously before the pandemic. Does it have a different meaning for you now when you look at this image after having been through a pandemic for 2 years, to see about
what's changed in this? Because the people I photograph, I live with the people. My journeys are not weeks and months. My journeys are years of living on the ground with the people and the subjects. It's a family that I've known for almost 30, 40 years. What has happened since I took that photograph is that Francois is now a grown young man, but while his mother looks after the pigeons now, he's gone off up into the mountains to dig for semi-precious stones in the hopes that the return of tourism into the country will provide him with an alternative income for the family.
And do you think you can help with your photography? You can help the country Namibia, what you're trying to express? And
I don't know whether I can. I hope. I'm trying my best. I think it's really important to find a platform, to find the listeners, to bring awareness, because I think there's Namibia is a complicated, complex country. It's gone through years of apartheid, through a 14-year border war, and now mismanagement, corruption. And it's difficult to find a voice and to bring, and I have promised and said I will try to take your voice, which is one, beyond the borders of the country. But also we have NGOs in the country. They are almost always failures. Some of them start off well and they inevitably have all failed. Currently, there's not one that's functioning.
yeah, well, that's I'm sure you make a difference, at least internationally, that they have you there.
Yes, to bring awareness, because Namibia is considered, it's a vast landscape of untrammeled, land with lots of, with wild animals and traditional indigenous. That's what people think. I want to change that and how people think. I want my viewers to look beyond their own comfort and beyond their own borders.
Yeah.
And to ask questions.
Yeah, no, this is one can tell and see that, and I'm sure you do. So David, your series is obviously very different. In the wake, you talked to us about grief and nature and self-worth and rebirth. What's your relationship with your series and sustainability? Where does this connect for you?
Yeah, I'm really interested in in questioning the human, maybe first of all, and kind of the borders that it puts up against nature, against other animals, against the animal, against the monstrous, like all these like borders that the human needs to put up to kind of like define itself. And so in the wake, which is a body of work where the black bodies in landscapes covered with soot, there's smoke, and maybe like every now and then a hint of fire. To me, it was about this this entanglement of blackness and nature, or blackness and wilderness, and how they are both categories that have been created in order to be exploited, and how there's a parallel within that. And so on one hand, I wanted to kind of capture that, and as you say, capture the grief of this kind of ongoing exploitation, and then on the other hand, maybe also suppose some sort of like alliance between the black body and nature, and see, if there's maybe some sort of like hybrid form that we can suggest through some sort of like shared vulnerability.
Yeah. Do you think that a human being, to cherish life more, or to think maybe about life and become more in depth, do you think it helps a human being to go through grief once in their life? There's always the saying that once people have been through grief or mourning, that somehow life changes to them. Do you think that's something that's relevant, because you spend a lot of time thinking about that?
I find it tricky. I would hope not. I don't think it should be necessary, and I think, it's also depends on like what sort of grief we're talking about. But if it can be avoided, then I think it should be. And so I think that's also why a lot of the work that I'm making is like trying to deal with some sort of almost like institutionalized grief that is like kept, that is like passed along maybe different Black communities or in different communities. And I think it's kind of important to like get aware of like these lines and these borders that evoke this grief, and to then be able to kind of address that and maybe undo it, or be able to grow aware of new ways of being that can prevent future grief. I think that's definitely more.
Yeah. Margaret, do you have a view on that? I'm just asking because it's very often that when we speak to our photographers from the pre-PICT, like Joanna Chomali, One Hope, that there's very often a grieving involved in their artistic expression. Do you have a view on that, on grief related to art, if it's something that helps or not, if one once has gone through grief? Or did you change your work after you went through certain stages in your life?
No, I always try not to look on the grieving side of things, but rather on the positive side of things. My work, of course, now is very different to what I was doing in the early part of my career. So I've very much followed art and the female domain across Africa, very much an in situ art, which took me across the African continent, hitchhiking in the years when there were no cell phones and no banks and no debit cards, credit cards, or no communication. And I'm talking about the late 60s, 70s, right through to 94, another 3 volumes, although I didn't know they were books at the time, going to be books. I've always been obsessed by shelter. And the women's domain and the matriarchal societies across Africa. And I've always tried to look for the beauty in right across the continent, as opposed to documenting the famines and the wars and the ugliness. So that in itself became an obsession, of like sort of trying to record a dying art across Africa. So I mean, that was 40 years of my career in analog, under very difficult circumstances.
Interesting. David, in one of your statements, you wrote, I'm reading this because it's your quote and not mine, so I want to read this. What is the ideal state supposedly preceding culture? Who profits from the idea of untouched wilderness? And thus the opposing concept of civilization. Can you expand on this a little bit? Because it's a very strong quote that always comes up again in our...
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's this traditional clash of nature and culture that is, I mean, if we're looking also at Namibia, for example, has been a drive within like the colonial process and the creation of the idea of race that is still haunting us today. This idea that there is some untouched place, a place without history, that nature has no history, that some people are closer to nature than others. That's also what I mean when I talk about the borders that the human needs to put up in order to define itself. That very clearly some beings are centered in the project humanity, while others are decentered or antagonized. And so I think there's this idea that nature itself is a construct, is one that I find quite interesting, because in order to define ourselves as civilized or cultured, we need some sort of counter concept, and that becomes this mysterious, untouched concept of nature.
Yeah. And another question, and not directly to nature, but lots of your motives are very fantastical or like fantasy-like. First of all, why are you drawn to them? And do they express something for you that we don't have in real life? Or what is the story about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think on one hand, it definitely, I think it's materializing. It's the materialization of feelings, of hopes, of dreams that fascinates me, and that I think fantasy does really well. Like speak to something that we might not be able to see in everyday life, but it does speak to us on an emotional level. Yeah, and I think that also speaks to what you said before, that you don't like to focus on grief so much as maybe hope and healing. And I find that this potential to think outside of the borders or the framework of like the everyday is super productive
and
for
helpful.
me.
Yeah, exactly. And then we will always get asked, David, there's one self-portrait of yourself, which is called, I don't even know how to pronounce the word right, Gaul. Gaul?
I would say ghoul. Yeah.
Ghoul?
Okay.
I don't know whether everyone knows what that is, but maybe you need to explain this to us. Can you explain to us the process in this photo? I don't know, it's coming up. It's David himself standing probably with coal and oil on yourself, so these two products, and how you've managed to take this photo of yourself. And it's very sporty, by the way, too, what you're doing. I'm not asking you to do this now, this pose for us.
It's like, okay, everyone, that's...
Yeah, you can, of course, but it's probably, I don't know whether it's coming up on the slideshow, but it is something. No, don't worry, Rosario, but it's probably coming up. Everyone will recognize it. Yeah, so first of all, what that word means, because it's not very common. And then secondly, what drew you to do this? And also using oil. And you speak about coal and how you've produced that.
Yeah, I mean, a ghoul. I need to also like check my definition, but it's some sort of like a fantastical creature, very much like tied in with the dead. So, depending on what context you speak about it, feasting on the dead. And to me, self-portraits have always been some sort of I mean, they're always, there are these overlying like large concepts and ideas that I find interesting and that I then arrange them in. But on a single image basis, they're always extremely personal, and they're always some sort of therapy, I would almost say. And so it's kind of also about, bringing out the darkest parts in yourself, or whatever it is that you're processing at the time, and being able to step into that persona and slip into that figure and fully embody it. And so that's usually what happens. That's what I did here as well. And so even physically, it's a super interesting process, because you create a moment in time that is super unusual for yourself. Often it's also quite uncomfortable. For this wasn't that uncomfortable. I just mixed I grinded up some coal and mixed it with oil. And I took this in my bedroom, and then the image was combined with a landscape image I'd taken the winter before. But yeah, wait, where were we?
Yeah, no.
I think that's it. It's a layered process.
And then a question I would ask both of you, that of course comes probably for every photographer. If you don't do self-portraits, how do you persuade other people, or I don't know, do you ask friends? Do you ask, do you go, this is, I mean, more a technical question, but how do you get other people, let's say you weren't posing yourself there, how do you persuade others to pose for you?
I mean, now I just show them the work, but also, I mean, I started out shooting my younger sister a lot. And then began roping in some friends and acquaintances, grew to strangers from the internet, and then occasionally people who also model. And it's a good mixture, and it's quite interesting, because on one hand, making self-portraits, you kind of know what it feels like to be in front of the camera, to be experiencing this, to be seen, how exposing it is, what it means to you during the process, what it means to you seeing the image afterwards. And so that, I think, is like an interesting perspective for sure, that then kind of helps also relate to people that are in front of my camera, whether they're friends and family or loved ones, where you almost need some sort of distance to then kind of like guide them, or strangers where it's super fascinating what like intense intimacy can be created within, like through this gaze.
And Margaret, in Namibia, are people resistant, or you said there are your friends as well. So.
No, I've never encountered resistance, but I do also spend a lot of time before even taking out a camera. Most parts of Namibia, certainly in the Namib Desert and the Kalaharis, people know my vehicle, they know me. So I think what's important is the relationship, because I'm interested in their lives, where they're coming from, what they're thinking, with their beliefs, long before I take photographs. There also are people who believe that their image is carried like the wind, and they want their word and their life to be carried someplace elsewhere, in search of perhaps some help, assistance. But I recently, in October last year, I returned to the Kalahari Desert and tried a new approach. Because I was very limited in my movements, because there were a lot of wild elephants in the area, and my campsites were being trampled. So I put up a cloth on sticks and invited different clans and groups to, if they wanted their photographs taken, to come and see me. So it's a new approach. I'm trying it out.
Yeah.
How's that working out so far?
Hmm?
How's that working out?
I woke up at 6 in the morning and there were about 33 people sitting outside my campsite with, and my camp assistant was putting on gallons of water and making tea and the millipap, which is their staple, and cooking food and meals. And I spent 10 extraordinary days with them all wanting to be photographed, yes. And then we would take a break and we would go off gathering food, which that's all we live on, gathering food and hunting at night. Mm. And then ritual dances at night, and praying for the rain and praying for the elephants to keep us safe. And
yeah. So in a way, you're both kind of taking images and dealing with a black experience, as we say. Do you think the this is English word, ethnicity plays a role here for you or not? Or do you make space for these issues we're all facing in the world, that it's this whole movement at the moment? So does it affect your work or not?
Well, in my case, I think being born there is, and speaking some of the dialects and understanding the dialects, so they see me as one of them. And I think that's a tremendous advantage. I know in most of my career traveling through Africa, where I never had a vehicle, I never used, I was riding camels and donkeys and donkey carts and to move across Africa. I think the fact that I was a woman traveling alone was to my advantage. It helped me be accepted, especially in the woman's realm, since it was their life and their work that I was interested in.
And for you, David?
I mean, it's definitely relevant and something that's on my mind a lot, because there are so many different power dynamics. I mean, if we're talking about race, that, yeah, making images. I mean, for me, it wasn't even a conscious decision, but at some point, the matter of my work definitely shifted. It's almost like I just started to set this sort of framework, because I was like, I really want to create something that is on some level unseen, and that people can kind of refresh themselves in. It's like this sort of, the fields are very dry and you definitely just need some rain. And to me, these images are kind of like the rain, because there's just so much that hasn't been visually explored. And I think that, yeah, I definitely believe in the power of photography kind of like shifting yourself into someone else's perspective and opening your eyes to new ways of being and new ways of seeing yourself even. And so all I can do is kind of like propose one specific point of view on like my take on maybe even just my Blackness, because it's definitely not a monolith, and see if people feel invited and kind of like start to grow and put that in. But I have been making work in my father's home country, Nigeria, a little more. And so there too, I mean, the power dynamics are really intense, because I come in as a European and locally I'm white. And so it's definitely something to continuously think about and to kind of, just
raise awareness.
And reflect within one's own relationships with the people that one works with and what the work is actually saying.
We're almost coming to an end, but if I asked you with a few sentences, would you say your works are speaking to each other, or they're so different that they don't, besides the sustainability fact or the pre-picté?
No, I think they are. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
From two worlds apart, and I'm really interested in hearing more about his David's revisits to Nigeria that I have spent quite a lot of hair-raising time in, and
that would be my next question for both of you. If you can tell us, and that would be my last question, what you're working on right now, Margaret, and what you're working on right now, if you can disclose this information to us already. So that would be interesting to hear what you're working on right now.
Well, it's an extension of some of the images that were in pre-picté of the experimental plots for biodiversity and study on plant growth and rainfall, measurement of rainfall versus protecting areas from herbivores and so. I found these amazing continuous structures of cages. So that's really what I'm working on at the moment. Cage series, whether it's plants, dogs. So I've put in a few in this screening for today. They're a metaphor, really, for the current situation in the country of being fenced in, not being able to have access to water and food. It's a big issue in the country. You talked earlier about needing perhaps to fence off, whereas fencing, whether it's a chicken or a donkey or a duck's egg, it's a big problem. So there's a lot of illegal fencing in the country, and it has a lot to do with with mining.
Yeah.
So 85% of Namibia is under mining concession. Major companies are coming in from all over the world, Russia, China, Canada, Australia, and are reaping the land. And it's being fenced off, and as Namibians, access cut off.
Yeah.
So that's really what I want to, but I can't go for major corporate companies around the world, but
you can raise awareness with your photographs.
I can raise awareness of what uranium, offshore mining. It's all good. There's a rush on for it in Namibia at the moment, and it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I can see that. No, that's you brought some. No, so whoever's interested later can speak to Margaret, and she has some of her preview images here. And David, what are you working on?
Nice. I just wrapped a 2-year project, a film installation that's autobiographical and kind of based on an Igbo tradition of building a house in the Nigerian village from afar. So even living in Europe or living in a city, you put your money into building this house in a village that you don't live in. And my father did that, and I kind of found, wait, that's a red thread for my family story. Let me unfold this in a 30-minute 4-screen documentary. And so just wrap that and trying to distribute it. And I'm currently, I think I will actually continue also to unfold ideas that I've kind of started to address in the wake. Like I'm really obsessed and keep returning to this visual of to the visual of fire, or to the visuals of soot, and this parallel to of soot on black skin. And yeah, I'm super excited about building like a maybe even a more narrative and like speculative fiction kind of work with it.
And then maybe one last question from me, and then to the audience. What's your view on NFTs?
It's also like, do we invest?
Yeah, do we? Not about the investment so much, but just because it comes up regularly. We had a talk here last year, and I tried to defend against 3 others on the panel why it's still different to go to an exhibition and see photographs actually and talk about them than having something on my iPhone and showing Margaret, this is like my new handbag here, I just bought this. So what's your view on that?
Tricky. I do think that, I mean, ecologically, it seems like a disaster.
Yeah.
There seem to be a handful of people working on it and trying to find different options. I don't know. Conceptually, doesn't feel that different to like editions of a photograph in print, and it's just the fact that it's digital makes it all the more abstract. But I feel like maybe it also says more about how absurd, the constructs of navigating photography in an art world and limiting its availability is in the first place. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mixed feelings.
And Margaret, do you have any views on that? No.
Okay. I live in the desert, NFT and all of that. I mean, technology, I'm lucky if I can get a phone call in anywhere.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking because we've been approached with a Pripicti if we want to proactively advertise against NFTs because of the ecological and economic, but how much energy it actually needs to save those images or whatever. So obviously we can't really do that, take such a position, but it's always coming up all the time that people say, what are you doing against NFTs? I said, no, we're not doing anything against it, but clearly it was a question I wanted to ask. So thank you very much from my side, and thank you especially for coming here in person, because it's always a pleasure to see you all. I mean, it's all one big family, hopefully the Pripicti photographers, all of you, and we stay in touch.